Pope Francis wasn't just speaking out for Christians who were suffering, he was speaking out for anyone who was on the receiving end of mistreatment. I think there are still many corners of uh, the Catholic world that still want to resist a little bit his open-heartedness to our Muslim friends. Part of the reason why we saw this outpouring of love and support for Francis when he was sick, and then since he died from the Muslim world, so to speak, was because Muslims felt like they knew him and that he was their pope too, in a sense, someone who genuinely cared about them.
There is only one God, and religions are like languages, paths towards God. Some Sikh, some Hindu, some Muslim, and some Christian. Those were the words of the late Pope Francis. Words that he lived by. Not only dedicating himself to his congregation, the 2 billion Christians that look to him for guidance around the world, but to the world itself. You just need to look at the statements coming out from world leaders mourning his passing, and religious leaders in particular, to see just the kind of impact that he had on religious communities. Not in words, but in action. Some of the strongest allies he made were in the Muslim world. Hours after his death, the Grand Imam of Azhar Ahmad al Tayeb described Pope Francis as a true friend to Muslims, sincere in his pursuit of peace. So how did he leave such an impact in such a divided time? Welcome to the Big Picture Podcast. My name is Muhammad Hassan, and today we speak to Georgetown University scholar Dr. Jordan Denari Duffner. Dr. Duffner is a theologian, author, and scholar of Muslim-Christian relations. She's the author of Finding Jesus Among Muslims and the upcoming book, Pope Francis and Islam. Dr. Duffner, thank you so much for joining us. Welcome to the Big Picture.
Thanks for having me.
I want to begin by asking you, as a theologian, as a Catholic, what this week is like, trying to come to terms, process the passing of such a monumental figure in your world and in all of ours.
Thank you. Yes, it was certainly a surprise to wake up to the news yesterday morning that Pope Francis had passed. He died early in the day on Easter Monday, which for Catholics and many Christians is usually a day off where we're not working. And so when I saw the messages roll in, I thought, oh, this is going to be a different day than we anticipated. But I feel sadness, but I also feel a lot of gratitude and really just pride in who Pope Francis was and the leader that we had for a dozen years. He really walks the walk, I think, for what it means to be a Christian. Someone who is humble, someone who challenges us to see the face of God in every human person, someone who isn't afraid to speak up for the rights of the marginalized, even if it might be hard for people to hear. And he was a funny person. He was a jokester. He was a loving person. He loved children. I mean, there are just so many things about him that Catholics appreciated, but then also people of other faith traditions too. And so that was one of the things that I really observed yesterday. I was getting personal messages, particularly from Muslim friends, because of my work in Catholic-Muslim relations. And they were just expressing how much, they were expressing their condolences, but what they appreciated about him and the fact that he, spent so much of his papacy reaching out to Muslims. And, for me personally, as someone who does Catholic-Muslim dialogue, the fact that the Pope prioritized this during his papacy was very affirming to me in my own work. And I felt like I had an example and someone to sort of look up to in that during his papacy, the fact that he was making this such a priority too.
And he was somebody who really, as you said, prioritized that interfaith dialogue that reached out to the Muslim world in ways that felt real to a lot of people. Where did that kind of work begin for him?
That's one of the things that I am still interested to explore, because I know that he had some Muslim friends and contacts when he was in Argentina, when he was the Archbishop in Buenos Aires. But I myself, in my research on Pope Francis and the fact that he has made this such a priority in his life, don't know some of the sort of earliest, I think, reasons why he made this a priority. I mean, my guess, also is that Pope Francis was really trying to respond to what we Catholics often refer to as the signs of the times. Basically, what are the things going on in the world that we need to respond to out of our faith as Catholics? And, when Pope Francis ascended to the papacy in 2013, it was amid, heightened Islamophobia. It was amid, the Syrian refugee crisis. I think back to 2015, 2016, where here in the United States, where I am, there was all of this anti-Muslim rhetoric, anti-refugee rhetoric, and Pope Francis really was standing against that, both, in Europe, where he was, but also sort of globally. And so I think he knew that it was really important for Catholics to reach out to Muslims during this time, because of our shared, theological and ethical, the things that we share in terms of our faith tradition, but then also for the purpose of standing up for justice and peace and those sorts of things too. And I think he definitely did that over the course of his papacy.
And if I could ask you to, let's dig into some of those details. What exactly did he start doing around that time? As you mentioned, it was a very heightened time, both in the Middle East, across the Muslim world, but also in the West, in America and Europe, with the refugee crisis, with a lot of the anti-Muslim rhetoric that had heightened around that time. What were some of the things that he did or said that really kind of solidified this as something that he was going to take on as a challenge?
Yeah, so I think first and foremost, Pope Francis forged personal relationships with Muslims, both leaders, major world leaders, but then also ordinary people. So some of the examples that I can think of are when he visited a Muslim family in Rome, who I forget what country they were originally from, or whether or not they were recent immigrants to Italy, but he was making impromptu visits to different people in Rome, like in an apartment complex or something. And he stopped by a Muslim family that lived there, and they gave him treats, and they showed him a lot of the Islamic art in their home, and were explaining the significance behind it. And they just had sort of a normal human interaction, getting to know one another. I think the children, played with Pope Francis or showed them some of their drawings. Um, but then we go up to the highest levels too. I mean, Pope Francis forged this personal friendship with the Grand Imam of Al Azhar, Imam Ahmad al Tayeb, and it was out of that friendship that they then issued what is now called the Document on Human Fraternity, this joint statement which they wrote as equals, basically calling on their faith traditions and harnessing their different, theological and ethical principles in order to address things like, the environmental crisis, issues of migration, issues of, um, the mistreatment of women, war and the arms trade. I mean, you name it, they sort of touched on it in this document, and they really wanted to, I think, encourage people of faith and people from other backgrounds to address these different problems. And I think, this document carried a lot of moral weight because you have, the Pope, who is the leader of the largest denomination of Christians globally, and you have the Grand Imam of Al Azhar, who is an important figurehead in Sunni Islam, and they both have a lot of, I think, and they have a lot of people who are looking at them and seeing what they'll do. And the fact that they were willing to work on this together and to do it as equals and as friends, I think is so important, because so often I think there's this perception that, religious people are, trying to have a leg up on the other community, or
They're
cast
competing
themselves
with
as
each
the
other.
righteous one. Exactly. Cast themselves as the righteous one. And they really work together on this. And, one of the things too that I think particularly Catholics don't know is that the human fraternity document and that relationship with the Grand Imam was, in many ways, Muslims taking initiative to form that relationship with Francis. And so it's definitely been a priority of Francis himself to reach out to Muslims. And I think he said that about 10 days into his papacy, that he wanted to make dialogue with Muslims a priority. But that wouldn't have happened unless the Muslims had also reached out. And so I think that's one of the reasons why we've seen all these different initiatives. To say a little bit more, Pope Francis also went to a lot of mosques. He visited a lot of Muslim majority countries, and again, there was meeting with religious leaders, but then also just sort of interfacing with ordinary people. And I think, part of the reason why we saw this outpouring of love and support for Francis when he was sick, and then since he died from the the Muslim world, so to speak, was because Muslims felt like they knew him and that he was their pope too, in a sense. Someone who genuinely cared about them.
And I don't think I remember a pope or head of the Catholic Church in recent memory that, or actually any religious leader that had this kind of personal affection on so many people. People really felt like they knew who he was, and I think part of what you said about him having a sense of humor and being this kind of quirky figure in a way really went that like a long way towards that. But do you see him as somebody who was particularly unique in that manner? Was he doing things that were different from the way that the heads of the Vatican had done before?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, in a lot of ways, Pope Francis built on the work of his predecessors. John Paul II, for example, who was Pope when I was a child, um, he made a lot of, I think, important theological statements. He always was reminding Catholics of our teaching, which is that Christians and Muslims, along with Jews, believe in the one God. Now, we do have theological differences and sometimes major ones, but at the end of the day, we are directing our prayers towards the one God, and oftentimes having, calling on God with the same names, like the merciful and the just and things like that. Um, and so John Paul II also visited a lot of Muslim majority countries. There's some really amazing speeches, I think, from when he went to Morocco and other places. Benedict was, he had some missteps when it comes to Catholic Muslim relations, and we can always talk about that. But I think Pope Francis, is really taking what his predecessors did on a rhetorical level and was sort of living it out in practice. So we see him washing the feet of Muslim refugees during the Holy Thursday service, which is was sort of a groundbreaking thing. This sort of ritual that for Catholics represents uh, what it means to sort of be a servant leader, and also kind of who is included in the community. Oftentimes, it's just fellow Catholics, or even sometimes it's just uh, men whose feet are washed. But in this case, he really expanded it to include women and to include people of other faith traditions. Um, and so, he did things like that. I mean, the first place he ever went, his first apostolic trip outside of the Vatican, was to the island of Lampedusa to welcome refugees who had just made sort of this harrowing voyage across the Mediterranean. And I think he really wanted to be with people in their suffering, and just did that over and over again for the 12 years that he was Pope.
And one of the things that I found particularly interesting about him was that he seemed very connected to the minutia of day-to-day events in the world. He seemed like somebody who was consumed the news and was very aware of what's happening, would respond in real time to things that were happening. And I am sure that got him his fair share of criticism. Certainly, I think, in those first early years when he was talking about mass migration and refugees, did people within the church kind of think that he was maybe a little bit too political, or that he was kind of using his role to do something that felt like it was outside of what his role was supposed to be?
Possibly. I mean, I think we as Catholics generally have this sense that our faith should speak to the social issues and the political issues of our time. I think by and large that, is something we all agree with. It's just a question of how do we apply our faith, right? And I think there are some ways that Pope Francis was really challenging us to to push back against some of the, nativist tendencies, or some of the exclusionary tendencies that we were seeing in Europe and we were seeing in the United States and elsewhere. And not even just in the West. I think about, he really stood up for the Rohingya Muslim community that was being persecuted in Myanmar, and really made it a point to speak directly to their plight and to sort of acknowledge their identity and what had happened to them. And um, that wasn't always what people wanted to hear. I mean, the thing that's so amazing about Francis is that um, I think he's very committed to speaking out against injustices, but he's also not above interfacing with leaders that he might disagree with. And so, like, for example, right before he died, he met with the Vice President of the United States, J.D. Vance, and they certainly have some different positions on some really important issues. But Pope Francis was still willing to engage with him even while having these differences. And so I think that's a really good example for all of us. It doesn't mean we compromise on our morals at all, but it does mean that we can still talk to each other and really try to bring others to an understanding of what our faith is calling us to in terms of how it should be lived out.
And towards what was now, we now know were the last months of his life, he really became one of the most vocal advocates for Palestinians in particular. There's these stories that you hear about him talking to Palestinians in a church in Gaza every night for months on end. This really left a massive mark on not only Palestinians but the Muslim world in general. What was that relationship like? Do you even know where it possibly could have been forged?
Yeah, so I know that the pastor at the parish in Gaza is himself Argentinian, like Pope Francis. And so I don't believe they knew each other beforehand, but clearly a relationship was forged. And I'm not sure if they were in contact before October of 2023. But clearly very quickly they were in frequent communication, daily communication, as you said. And so Pope Francis, I think, had a very intimate understanding of what the Palestinian Christian community in Gaza was going through, and by extension, the Muslim community is there as well, because the Holy Family Parish in Gaza was housing not just Catholic Palestinians, but also Orthodox Christians and Muslims as well. I believe about 500 people have been sheltering there. And it's very, to your point before, Pope Francis is very connected with the minutia of people's lives, not just reading headlines, but very much trying to experience or understand the reality that people are living through. So yeah, and I think, he felt compelled to speak out, about this and to use his platform to call for a ceasefire. I mean, he was probably one of the earliest world leaders to call for a ceasefire in Gaza, which he reiterated. I don't know how frequently, but I would guess almost on a monthly basis or bi-monthly basis, just kind of um, expressing this message. And I don't know what kind of closed door meetings he was having with leaders as well. I would not be surprised if he was, knowing, his concern for the situation. But as Catholics, we have, and we share this value with people of other faith traditions too, that every person has inherent dignity. And whenever that, God-given dignity is not being respected, we need to advocate on their behalf. And so I think that was, that's sort of the basis that Francis is coming out of when he's calling attention to the situation of the Palestinians. And that's the same, sort of theological basis that has him speak out about lots of different issues. And so I think he really helped Catholics in many parts of the world to sort of recognize the plight of the Palestinian people in a way that they might have not before.
And when we talk about Christians and Catholics and Muslims, these people have existed in each other's orbits and they've lived together for millennia. And yet we increasingly live at a time where it feels like there is this divide that often gets referred to in politics, often gets described as this clash of civilizations, as these two worlds that can't live together, can't coexist. And I want to ask you about your own work. You published a book called Finding Jesus Among Muslims, and which is such a powerful title. What is your insight into that world, into those relationships? Does it resemble at all the picture that it looks like on the box?
Yeah, I mean, I think there are certainly instances we can see, and even trends throughout, modern and in our modern time and in history, where we see Christians and Muslims at odds, or we see the West pitting itself against the Muslim world and the Muslim world pitting itself against the West. I mean, even these sort of identities or these phrases, or some historian scholars that I know talk about how these ideas were sort of forged in contrast, to each other. And these identities in certain ways are salient for people, this kind of oppositional identity. But when you actually dig deeper into actual lived human experience, I think it's a lot more complicated, and there's a lot more coexistence and ordinary living and positive relations that oftentimes just don't make the news. And that's one of the reasons why Pope Francis's encounter with the Grand Imam of Al-Azhar and with the Ayatollah in Iraq, Ali Sistani, and these sorts of relationships were so important to highlight, because they do upset that conventional wisdom of a clash between Christians and Muslims. And as someone who studies this both in our own time and in history, I would imagine that the positive connections between Christians and Muslims outweigh the negative ones. It's just because they are ordinary, and the kinds of things that you wouldn't necessarily always think to publicize, we're left with this false perception of conflict. And, that's why in my work, a lot of what I've been trying to do more recently is to sort of highlight these positive relations. Or like I just wrote a piece when Pope Francis got out of the hospital about all of the messages from Muslims that I had received, that I saw on social media, with Muslims wishing the Pope good health, and indicate, them sharing that they'd prayed for him, because that is what's more common, I think. It's just not what we often see.
And I think, in particular, like a shining example of that is the story of Palestinian Christians. And I've spoken to many of them, including a lot of religious leaders who say, nobody sees us, nobody recognizes that there are not only Christians here, but there's a foundation of Christianity that exists in this part and that is still very much alive when people talk about Bethlehem and the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. And I think, one of the things that Pope Francis was able to do was just almost uplift the voices of those Palestinians, particularly in Gaza. What did that mean for these Christians who maybe felt like they were being overlooked?
Yeah, I mean, my sense is that they did feel very seen, and we're very grateful that the Pope sort of drew attention to their situation, because for decades they've been begging for Western Christians to pay attention. And yeah, I mean, to your point, I think many in my faith community here in the West don't even have a sense that Palestinian Christians exist. There's this conflation of Palestinian with Arab with Muslim. They just assume that Palestinians are all Muslim. And then so Israel-Palestine ends up becoming this religious war, or this religious conflict in the minds of, I think, many Americans and many Christians in the West, the idea of Israeli Jews versus Palestinian Muslims. And it's a whole lot more complicated than that. I think there are people from all three of these faith traditions who are standing on the side of justice and peace and equality. And so I think that's really important to, sort of remember and elevate. But yeah, Palestinian Christians and Muslims have been living side by side, as you say, for a lot, hundreds and hundreds of years. And so, even just sharing that fact upsets a lot of the stereotypes and misperceptions that people here in the West have. And, I think oftentimes there's sort of an implicit, there's Catholics and other Christians here in the West have an inability to sort of identify with Palestinians, because they don't know that they're Christian. Now, I think, that regardless of a community's religious identity, we should be able to identify with the suffering and stand on the side of the suffering. But I think just sort of it's also important for us to remind Christians, here in the States, that members of our own faith community are going through this, are, sheltering in this church in Gaza, are praying the rosary, are going to mass every day with the bombs falling around, with, very limited access to food. I mean, living in really inhumane circumstances. And so it's just important to remind people of that.
And there is a tendency, and you hear it a lot, certainly on the political scene, that there is this natural affinity between Christians in the West and Israel and the Israeli government. And that often is kind of used as a justification for why anything from, why we should be allies with Israel, all the way to why we should be arming the Israeli government. Why do you think that relationship exists, and why is it so strong?
Yeah, there's a long history of it, and I don't. I'll be honest, it's not, my area of expertise. I've done some reading and some work on it, but I think that there is a phenomenon known as Christian Zionism. This idea that Christians have either a theological or a political belief that there needs to be Jewish dominance over what we call the Holy Land, or Israel Palestine. That's sort of articulated in lots of different ways. Different Christian groups will sort of have different reasons for that belief, or they'll articulate it in different ways. Sometimes it's because of a particular interpretation of scripture. But because of that, and I think also because of a lot of evangelical Christian political activism around Israel in the United States, there is this sort of baseline, or sort of assumed, like you said, kind of allyship between the Christian United States and, the state of Israel. Catholics don't have a Christian Zionist theology. But I think sometimes because we're sort of just saturated in that environment here in the United States, we sort of just also assume that we should have, this sort of unquestioning relationship and allyship with Israel. So I think, part of the work that many Christians and many Catholics have been doing is to just sort of try to complicate that perception, or to bring in some of these other facts and factors to help people better discern, what our faith is calling us to. So I think, that's a little bit of what's going on.
And when you consider the legacy of someone like Pope Francis and the work that he did, not only to uplift the voices of Palestinian Christians, but the tremendous work of outreach to the Muslim world and forming those fraternities as you described, what impact do you think he leaves, not only on the Catholic world, but the world in general?
Yeah, I mean, I certainly hope that his message has been absorbed by Catholics. I think there are still many corners of uh, the Catholic world that still want to resist a little bit his open-heartedness to our Muslim friends. I have seen some pushback from different Catholics, whether they be politicians or ordinary people or other leaders. But I do think that the example he set is is increasingly seen and heard by many people. And I think our task now, at least speaking for myself as a Catholic, is to just sort of reinforce, the things that he put in motion, and keep the ball moving. In terms of his influence globally, I mean, I think my sense is that he is one of the most morally consistent, sort of, or was, leaders on the world stage, speaking up for the rights of the poor and the marginalized and the oppressed. And that's not lost on people. That's not lost on, on Muslims. That's not lost on our friends in other faith communities too. And so, my sense is that he will be really appreciated for the fact that he would speak out for those who are suffering, regardless of their identity. I mean, that's the thing. Pope Francis wasn't just speaking out for Christians who are suffering. He was speaking out for anyone who was on the receiving end of mistreatment.
And finally, Dr. Duffner, obviously I'm speaking to you as a Catholic, but also as an expert. There is now going to be this search for somebody to replace Pope Francis and take the mantle of this huge responsibility. What kind of person do you hope that new Pope becomes?
I hope for someone who has Francis's disposition, someone who is humble, someone who is jovial, someone who is committed to justice, someone who is willing to listen. Pope Francis, one of the buzzwords of his papacy was dialogue or encounter, and he understood that as simply sharing our joys and sorrows with other people. And so I really hope for someone who sort of shares that vision and has that disposition as well. And I think he has. I forget what percentage of the cardinals he appointed, but I think there are a lot of potential popes waiting in the wings who share that disposition and who share his priorities. And so I really, as we say in the Catholic Church, we pray and we hope that the Holy Spirit is in this process and guides the selection of our next leader.
Dr. Jordan Denari, Dr. Duffner, I really appreciate your time and your insight. Thank you very much for joining us today.
Thanks for having me. It's great to talk to you.
Thank you for watching this episode of The Big Picture, and a big thank you to Dr. Jordan Denari Duffner for being our guest today. As always, you can listen to this episode and all of our episodes wherever you get your podcasts from. And until next time, I'm Mohammed Hassan. Salam.